It is November 6th, 2021, and it's about 11:30 here in the morning on a Saturday. And my name's Ernie Mosteller, and we are um, here at the Methodist Church in Mount Dora, and I'm interviewing Herman Durias. Herman, will you talk to me? Tell me who you are, where you're from, how long you've been around. I'm just meeting you for the first time.
Hi, I'm Herman Durias, and I been around here in Mount Dora probably the entire life. I'm currently about 64 years old. Born and raised here in the big city of Mount Dora. Currently still have a home in Mount Dora, living in Mount Dora. Family still here in Mount Dora, have some still here.
So you grew up here. Did you go? You went to Mount Dora High School?
I grew up here. I went to school. Went to Milner Roosevelt Academy first. I went to Milner Roosevelt Academy. At that time, we were, kind of segregated still. A lot of kids went to Milner. A lot of friends that I know and ended up growing up with went to Roseboro. I went to Milner up until 6th grade. At that time, we had the opportunity to go to Roseboro, but my home was right across the street from Milner. So I didn't feel like I needed to walk the 15 blocks downtown to go to Roseboro. So I ended up staying at Roseboro, at Milner, I mean. And then the following year, basically all 7th graders went to Mount Dora High School. So I was in the class that went 7th to 12th grade there. So I was at Mount Dora High School from 7th grade to I graduated.
What year did you graduate?
The year I graduated from Mount Dora High School was 1975. 1975 I graduated.
So we're talking about one of the things that's interesting about Mount Dora is that it's historic and the history of Mount Dora in the early days is really well documented. Now, as you get to the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, which neither you nor I want to admit, the 70s are history now, it's not very well documented. So I want to talk about elementary school, high school years, growing up around here and what it was like. And when you're a kid, you don't necessarily think about it, but looking back, what was it like growing up in Mount Dora in the mid 60s, late 60s?
Well, growing up in Mount Dora in the mid 60s and late 60s was very interesting. Growing up. Like I say, it was still one of those areas where, this area was still a little segregated. So we kind of stayed on our side of the town. Everybody else kind of stayed on their side of the town. Growing up, pretty much, you had dirt roads, a lot of dirt roads. Actually, the street that my house was on, it was Road Street. I lived on Road Street, but it was a dirt road. You had very few any paved roads in my side of town where we lived. Actually, I lived in, they call it East Town. So we lived over in East Town, and great place to grow up. It was everybody there knew everybody. Families knew everybody. We played with the same kids. We just enjoyed living in that part of town. It was different, but throughout the years, even that, we did, venture downtown because, we would go down to the Five and Dime store. And during that time also, early 60s, late 60s, early 70s, I had an older brother. He's since passed. But he worked at the Rexall drugstore downtown in Mount Dora. So, we got a lot of stuff downtown, went downtown. I think my favorite place to go would be the donut shop downtown. It was a donut shop downtown. You got those glazed donuts. You think, right now everybody think Krispy Kreme is the best, or, the hot lights on, but those donuts were the best.
We interviewed Mrs. Romer, and it was, yeah, man, those were
Yeah.
insane. And the Rexall. Did you go in the Rexall and get like vanilla Cokes and all
Vanilla
that?
Cokes and everything, and would love the little 5 a dime store. I guess it's on the corner where what is that? The Mexican place is right now. Actually, the Cuban place is. That was a little 5 and dime store. You can get in there. Everybody's thinking, you have 5 cents, you can get $5 worth of candy. Nowadays, it'll cost you $5 for those little 5-cent things that you got then. So it was, different growing up. Throughout the years, throughout once we got to the high school, when I got to the high school, you start meeting friends, and a lot of my friends, like I said, did go to Roseboro, but we all met up again back at Mount Dora High School.
It was like, I know like the families that went to Roseboro, because I was at Roseboro, so we had Ronnie Sims and like Asbury Johnson, I think, that whole crew
Yes.
that went to Roseboro. I didn't realize you guys didn't come till later.
Yeah. We didn't come
Well,
till
you
later.
lived across the street.
Well, I lived across the street, so it wasn't, I lived across the street from Mildner, which, was a great place to go, because, when you went to Mildner, you knew everybody. Everybody there at Mildner looked like you. So that was a big difference, and, back in the early 60s, I read back now and I read stuff and it's like, all this happened, why would I go where, people of my color was not treated the same, as I was going to go across the street. So why go back? But, it was one of those learning phases. My friends who went here, they came back and we played marbles together. So we, and I talked to them about, school. But, at that time, to me, not only living across the street, but I got to be with people and teachers who basically looked at me and looked the same way. So even there, there were some great teachers there. So, I had some great teachers that, there. I had my first grade teacher was Miss Russell. I had Marjorie Jackson as a second grade teacher. Coach T.H. Poole, not Willie Poole. Willie Poole was at Mount Dora High. T.H. Poole, who was a big part of the NAACP at that time, and he was the PE coach. Nathaniel Bell, who was he was very good disciplinary. He's a big man and he had carried a big paddle. So. And then you look at a lot of things around. You got C.O. Lott. And he was the principal. And it was fun. Those are the years. You knew everybody. They knew everybody. They knew all the families. So it was easier to And that didn't stop to I got in trouble one time. And that one time the teacher just came across the street and talked to my mom, and from that point on, it was no issues. And even growing up in that side, in Easttown and where we lived, it's more like a little village because if you get in trouble at school, before you get home, your parents already know. Or if your parents were working, I had the Hines who lived there. I had Reverend McNear that lived across the street from us, and they were like, they're all, I had so many mothers and fathers because, they would be there to take care of you or they'll be there to discipline you. And there was no issues from my parents if Mrs. McNear or Reverend McNear said something to me because we were all one little family.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience, it was the same at Roseboro. It was such a small town that whatever you did at school beat you home.
Yes, always.
It beat you home, and I was told on day one that you get a whipping at school, you're gonna get 2 more when you get home.
Yeah, you might get 2 or 3 on the way home, and so it was like, you mind your P's and Q's. You did what was told and did what you needed to do. But like I say, Betty Coney was she was a great, drama teacher and music teacher. So it was a lot of great teachers there. Well, yeah, it was very, growing up, it's, even from the 60s to 70s, the 80s, it was very vibrant, you had, stores where you can go grab food. You had, the little barber shops, Mr. Ben and Mr. Ben Hill and Mr. Larry had a barber shop there. Had a little 5 and dime store, it was all on Grant and Grandview. Around the corner of Grant and Grandview, we're there. Had a couple little, what they call, I had to tell somebody the other day what a juke joint was. They didn't know what a juke joint was, so they looked it up and, had a couple of juke joints and everything. So growing up there, you had all those little things and, you had places to go. We didn't have the, big type restaurants, but we had little mom and pop shops. And one of those little mom and pop shops in the 80s was my mom's. My mom had, what is called the Blue Tip Cafe. The Blue Tip Cafe, sold breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Great little place to eat food. That's where everybody, all the neighborhoods came and ate. A couple other little places had a little barbecue place. So it was very vibrant, like you said. A lot of things going on. Weekends, it was always, fun stuff to do. As kids, we were outside all the time. We were always outside, visiting other families, visiting other people. Like I say, playing on the dirt road, playing sandlot football, or, that's pretty much what you do. I played sandlot football, and I can remember my friends one day. We was playing sandlot football, and basically I broke my collarbone playing sandlot football. So they drugged me to the house, dropped me off at the door because I didn't want to talk to my dad. So it was fun. It was a great time. The same ones I grew up playing marbles with, or playing stickball, or any of those things was there.
Give me some names.
Well,
Who'd you hang out with?
I hung out with Donald Harris, who was he was a year ahead of me. I played with Donald Harris. One of my 3 best friends are Roosevelt Moody, Willette Welton, and those were some of the best friends that I had. Living in the neighborhood. Those are great friends in the neighborhood. So we did a lot of stuff together.
Did you play like Little League baseball? Did you? Because that was, there was no like Little League football until later on. But
yeah, I played Little League baseball. I played Little League baseball, and we went over to. You look back and you hear it and say, my dad always say, you don't need to be over in Pistolville after dark. And I always used to say Pistolville. And well, that was the place that blacks didn't go after dark. It's right down the road, but that's where the baseball field was. We played Little League baseball over in the Pistolville area. But Roosevelt played. By that time, they had Jack Harris playing, Doug Tuden. I played with Alan, Ben. We all played. And that time of the year, back in those days, you're sponsored by the Lions, Rotary, or the Kiwanis sponsored a team.
in Legion.
And the Legion, yeah, I had 4 of them. Had the 4 of them, and we was always played on the Lions team, and I played on the Lions, and we had one of the best teams out. It was me, Ben, Doug Tuden, Jack Harris. We was all on one little team, so it was interesting. So we played a lot of Little League baseball, Little League and Pony League baseball.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was a big time for everybody our age back then.
Yeah.
So all right, so it's 7th grade now. You're going to Mount Dora High School. Talk to me about your buds. Talk to me about like what was it like that first year of Mount Dora High School?
Yeah, well, actually, let's see, wasn't bad. I spent some time at the high school. Prior to that, I was a football manager when I was like in sixth grade because my brother played football. And he played football there, so I was a manager. Loved being around football and football team, and with Dan Spears, who was the coach. So, like I said, I was a manager, up until the time I played football. Going to Mount Dora High School as a seventh grader, it was scary. You was a seventh grader, and then you got people in 12th grade. So you look at an age gap, and then there's a big difference. Not only that, now you're there with, kids I didn't know, because they didn't go to Milner. I knew all the kids that went to Milner. I knew all the kids that lived in my neighborhood, but didn't know all the kids that now were, the Hispanics or the whites. That was, who are these people? Didn't see them other than maybe at the store or something like that. But, now they're my classmates. So it was interesting that first year, trying to acclimate myself to, teachers and classes and not seeing the same faces that I used to see from kindergarten up to sixth grade. Now see other teachers and now have to look at how I'm going to be taught, and how your classes are put together. Do we have, if I'm going to be in all black classes, I'm going to be in black and white classes. So that was an interesting part. And just being little on the big campus.
I'll say this: you're a very outgoing guy, and as long as I've known you, you have been. It's like how I believe history is not history's good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes.
Were you accepted? Were you embraced? Were you reluctantly accepted? What was it like?
I think no, I was accepted. A lot of kids were accepted. Actually most of them were accepted, but then it was a lot different than being with all your friends. I was accepted because I played Little League with some of these kids. I played, I ate at their house, and there's that group that you work with and you play with, and, you're in class with now. So those are accepted, things like that. There were some that, at school I could talk to, but after school, if they go home, it's a whole different story. They're not going to tell their parents that they're talking to, they got a black friend. So they're not, it didn't transfer from home to school, actually from school to home, because you couldn't. You couldn't go over there and no way you're going to go sit there and talk with them because it was totally different. It hadn't changed that much from some of the parents. Some of the kids are trying to get through it, but still. And they've been told totally different things.
That is my experience. That kids, we got along, and it was our parents that didn't want to accept it.
Yeah. A lot of parents accepted and embraced it, and it was like I grew up with my parents is that everybody's created equal. They treat you right, you treat them right. It doesn't matter, because this is what they learn, and they instill in their kids, who was me, my parents did, and my brothers and sisters. So that was one of the things that you had to look at, and parents at that time, some were different, very different.
That's true. That's very true. All right. So you're in high school now, and mid part of high school, all of that. I know you played football. Talk to me about the culture of Mount Dora as it revolved around the high school? Just the overall culture of Mount Dora as it revolved around the high school, and specifically about sports.
Um, like I said, sports, with me was very big. I played Little League. My parents allowed me to play all those little things. So when I got to high school, at that time you had middle schools, you had 7th, 8th, and eighth grade basketball. So we had, those teams. So it was very big for those teams, and those kids playing those grades. Like I played 7th grade basketball, and we played right over here at Roseboro. That's where all the games was, on those little gym, those 3 steps bleachers. So we played 7th grade basketball, 7th, and then the next 8th grade. So it all revolves around that, and I think with sports bring anybody closer, because now you're working as a team. It doesn't matter who you are, what color you are, most people work together, because in the end, everybody wants to win. So everybody's going to play hard and really play hard. At that time, had Gary Nicholson as a coach. He coached a lot of the younger grades, until we got older, and coached some JV. But 7th grade, 7th and 8th grade, we played, separately. So you wasn't able to play 9th grade basketball. It wasn't like now where, well, even then, 7th grade, you still consider middle school. It was like, kind of like middle school. That, you made great friends with that group as you continue to grow, and every year it got, you still had that same camaraderie of all those same group of kids that, most of them, played. And going to Mount Dora High School, you played every sport. So it wasn't like, you played basketball, you didn't play anything else. You start the year of football, you go to basketball, you go to baseball, you run track. So everybody kind of did all those things. For a small school, we had a lot of great teams. And the camaraderie within those players was very good. So it was different. Like I say, I didn't start playing football till my sophomore year. All my other friends played when they was in 8th grade, 9th grade, when they were able to play. But having had that incident, and staying on football and broke my collarbone, and my mom going, growing up, and my parents didn't go to a lot of games. We probably talked a little bit about, them and their work ethic. And the one game they did go to, my brother was playing. Hot night, he was a running back, and, he was down on the field a couple times, and, she really thought they were hurt, but it's more, the cramping and things like that. So after that, I wasn't playing football. So for years and years, I wanted to play football, and finally, Coach Willie Poole, came to the house and talked to my parents and asked could I play, JV, can I play football? And they said nope. So finally they did, let me play my sophomore year, and it was fun, and I enjoyed playing, and that time, I got to be around, a lot of kids, that we played football with. I played with, ninth, which would have been the class of '74. It would have been like, Cleve Hickson. We had Bruce Williams. We had, Robert Scott was had Ben Seabrook, Alan Seabrooks. We had, Ben Rapus. We had a lot of great running backs, football players, and they all played basketball, so they all played football, and some played baseball, but most of them ran track. So we were always together.
That's trying to explain to friends of mine who grew up like in big cities and stuff. It's like in a small town. You play.
Yeah.
And hopefully you're good, but one way or another, you get to play.
you get to play, it's small town, and, it's always, you didn't have to worry about anything. Your parents didn't have to worry about it because they knew you was either at football practice or at home, studying, or you're at football, you're at basketball. You always got something going on. And it's not like, I would say today, more kids are concerned about, I'm turning 16, I want to work, get a car, and I'm working to pay for a car, gas, and I'm not saving any money, and I'm not being well-rounded because I'm not playing any sports. So it was a little different. My parents said, your job is to go to school and make good grades, and be in a club, sports, anything like that. That's your work. So that was part of it. Well, growing up, my parents, came from Reddit. Well, my mom, and they came to Mount Dora, and we, the house that we live in now is, still in the family, still there. Both parents were laborers. For early on, they were really laborers. They, you did the seasons. You did the seasons. You go from orange, watermelon. Some go, up the road to New York and the Carolinas for onions and apples. So it was one of those things that they were always on the road, or always doing, going places to make ends meet. It was, oranges and the citrus business was very big. That's where a lot of people made money. It was the citrus business, picking oranges. Everybody thought oranges easy picking, but it's not easy picking. You might go to the store and pick one, that's easy, but when you got to pick them off the tree, it's a little different. Both parents worked in the citrus business. Even my mom had what is called a crew, so that she would take, out to the orange fields, and that's where they picked oranges and everything. My dad worked for a company out of Umatilla. He worked for the Tire and Taylor, Lynn Tire, so he great person to work for. So Umatilla Packers, that was what it was called. So they had those crews that they did, and went out to the fields, and like I said, from there, then in the watermelon season would come, and there was a watermelon season. It was very good. When it was good, the season was good if there was a lot of watermelons or a lot of oranges, and before the cold comes, there was a couple of times you had cold snaps, and I used to go out and put the burners out for the orange groves, and that was interesting. Try to keep the trees from freezing. A couple of those years we had a lot of freezes, and then watermelon season. My parents instilled in me a great work ethic between me and my brothers and all my sisters, even my cousins and everything like that, because we all kind of did a lot of stuff together. One of the things that they always instilled in me was like, work and all this, but still, I used to go out to get extra money, to try to make money, and work in the watermelon fields, because I was playing football. It was a good way to stay in shape. So you go there, but my parents always said that you can come and work, but here's what I like for you to do, and talk to my brothers and sisters, and that we work hard to get you what you need, or what you need. Not all we don't get all our wants. We didn't get a lot of wants. We got what was needed at the time. And if you wanted wants, you figured out a way how to get your wants. Because I want you to be successful, so you do this, and you make good grades in school, so you don't have to work as hard as I work. We don't want you to. We like y'all to go to school. We want you to go to school. So, and to this day, I'm very proud of my parents and how hard they work. So I would do, as they was getting older in their life, I did whatever I can, because I was successful because, of their ability, and I see their work ethics, and they were saying that they didn't want me to work as hard as them, because when you work in the fields all day and you come home, you're tired, and it's not a whole lot to do. But if you got family, you got these things to continue to do. So you had that. So my family was like that. You know, when we talk about church, church was, you know, the backbone of a lot of things, you know, you know, families and everything. And, you know, growing up, you went to Sunday school every Sunday, and you stayed from Sunday school to church. So, you know, you think you're watching football, anything on Sundays, you know, and actually we don't have one of those black and white TV, so it didn't really matter. So, you know, church was, you know, a big factor, you know, for us.
What church did you grow up in?
I grew up at Bethel Free Methodist Church. Bethel Free Methodist Church, right on the corner. We went there, you know, for years and years and years. Grew up. Like I say, went to Sunday school. You know, every fourth Sunday of the month. It was youth Sunday, so youth had to put on the service and the choir and all those things. A lot of Sundays you have Sunday meals there, you know, for some people who didn't have meals, so church was a meal for a lot of people. And everybody was welcome. Didn't matter if you believed in church or not, you were always there. So it was one of those things.
What about, I didn't realize your mom had a crew.
Yeah, growing up, my mom had a crew, my dad had a crew.
Because I remember, Walker used to.
Nathaniel Walker?
Yeah, Puddinhead.
Puddinhead, yeah.
Yeah.
Puddinhead had a crew.
Yeah.
Yeah, my mom had a crew, but, you know, she usually, you know, and when her crew and those people that she used, they did the smaller groves. They would call them walking buds, if you remember the walking buds. Okay, not the tall trees. It was one that probably about 8 feet high or most. They call them walking buds. So those are the ones that she did. Those fields. So, you know, I think I picked oranges probably twice.
That's about how many times I did it.
I went out and you're carrying that 10 to 15 foot ladder, wood ladder that's heavier than me. Put it in the tree. You know, it'd be like, you know, about lunchtime, I sit down and get my lunch and eat my sandwich. And I said, I'm not doing this anymore. So that's at that time, you know, that's when I really, the appreciation for my dad and the hard he worked. That's when he said that you need to work, go to school, do what you need to do, so you don't work as hard as me. That turned a little light on for me, you know, doing that. I enjoyed the watermelon, but oranges, nah, not so much.
What other things were there to do? And I'm thinking, like, in my head, it's like 3 years later, you know, we were going to McDonald's and hanging out at McDonald's after games and stuff like that. We were Hurricane Hut during the summers. What kind of stuff like that was there to do in the 70s around here?
Well, early 70s, 60s, like I say, you know, it was always fun to go to Hurricane Hut, you know, play, you know, all the little games there and everything. You know, Hurricane Hut was the place to go in the summer. Also at that time, you know, my mind goes and comes sometimes, but we still had a swimming pool over in Easttown. So that pool was there, so it was always like, you know, everybody came to the pool. You know, you swam all summer long, you know, that's all you did, swim and walk to the Hurricane Hut. Hurricane Hut, swim, you know, those kind of things that we, you know, in the summertime that we did. As far as, you know, doing football, you know, I played football, and, you know, football was, you know, like a great time. And, you know, we always had parents that after football games, you know, everybody went to a house. You know, I know late Mr. Seabrooks, who owned the pharmacy, you know, he lived out in the Lake Jim area out there. We used to go out there after every football game. They provide sandwiches and stuff, and that's where all the guys would sit around and talk about the game and just, you know, have fun. That was one of the big highlights of, you know, playing football, and, you know, after you got a good group of kids that was, you know, there.
Who all did you play with on the team? And any sports. I mean, it's like
any sports. You know, like I say, I played with Robert, Ben, Dan Martin was a great player. Bruce Williams, we played football. Ran track with Robert Scott, Callaway. Scott Alden played with us. He was Tom McCabe. He was, you know, his dad was a superintendent at one time. You know, we played, with, Donald Harris, Pomeo, let's see who else was all in that group. It was just so many, because our senior year, we had 32, actually on the football team, we had at least 28 seniors out my senior year of the team. So you can see that everybody played, everybody came out. It wasn't just one person, like I say, going from football, basketball, track. So it was a great time, sports brought everybody together. Club-wise, there was a couple of clubs on campus, but the best one was the Key Club, because I was part of Key Club. So that Key Club was fun. We did a lot of stuff around the community. Back in the old days, every Saturday after home football games, you can see the Key Club down at the football stadium, sweeping the football stadium. That was one of our, service projects, doing that, I think my main, one of my big things was going to Kiwanis, lunching. You get selected to go to Kiwanis lunching, and you come down and you eat Mrs. Curtis' food in the community building. She cooks some great food for, Kiwanis Club. You always have to get up and get the book and get out and sing and everything like that. So that was always fun, Kiwanis Club, and, so, even years after that, when I was still here in town, working, I joined the Kiwanis Club, and I was vice president of the Kiwanis Club. So I kind of went full circle, being a member, from coming from Key Club, going to luncheon, to being there all the time. So
That's cool.
clubs are fun. A lot of the groups, same old ones. Steve Williams in the Kiwanis Club. Andy Parker was with Parker Market up here. So it was a lot of fun growing up in Mount Dora. We had, I got to see a lot of friends. That did a lot of good things.
Any teachers stand out?
Um,
Good or bad?
Well, they're all were good teachers. I had a lot of great teachers. My favorite teacher was, one would have been Dr. McCoo. She taught trigonometry and math and everything like that. So Dr. McCoo was a great teacher. Can't go past Willie Poole, football coach. He always had a saying every day. He was a reverend too, so he always had some sayings for practice. So basketball was Coach Albritton, and he did a good job. Gary Nicholson. Even go back to I think go back to that 7th grade year. You go to Shank Hansen. So he was a big man, and he was dean or whatever you want to call it. So you didn't say a whole lot to him, but I got in trouble with him one time. That's all it took. So Shank Hansen. Well, after I got out of school, I chose to I went to Lisa McRae College in Vanderbilt, North Carolina. Myself and one of my buddies, Roosevelt Moody, we both went to Lisa McRae. At that time, it was a junior college. I had opportunity to go a couple other places, but this was, a place that I've never been. So went to Lisa McRae. They were called the Bobcats. Vanderbilt, great area. Just 30 minutes up the road from Appalachian State. Where at least we had a couple ski areas up there, beach and Sugar Mountain. So it was a great area. Played football there for a year. Broke my ankle, like third game of the season. So there was no more football at that time. But then towards the end of the year, I was able to run track there. Great area. I loved it there, but I just chose to decide, I don't think I want to play football anymore. I think I'm just going to go to school. So I transferred back down to Florida State. So I went to Florida State. So I'm going to walk on there. Walked on, played middle of spring, hurt an ankle again. So I decided football's not going to be for me. So my football Saturday was sitting in the stands at Florida State University watching the Seminoles. And that year was 1976. That was the first year Bobby Bowden had gotten there. And we were 0-11. So, but after that, Saturday Night Lights was great for Florida State football. Enjoyed it. Spent my years there at Florida State. Graduated with a degree in finance and accounting. Came back home. Came back home and started work for, at that time, Barnett Bank. I worked at Barnett Bank over in Winter Park. Worked there for a few years. Enjoyed the area. I was like in the consumer side of the bank. Came back home, lived there, then came back to Lake County area, working at Barnett for a few years. Then I decided I was going to change banks. Went over to Sumter County. Worked for Florida National Bank. Worked for the Florida National Bank, and worked there for a few years under some good people, and then came back over here to work. And at that time, I worked with Alan Seabrooks. He was a banker at that time, so I worked with Alan. I was in the banking business. Ben was in the banking business. So we had a lot that were in the banking. So did that for a few years. Actually, I worked in the banking business for about 15 years. 15 years. Had two young boys at the time. Got grown up. I was divorced, so then I, tried to figure out what I can do and be home with them. Because they're becoming teenagers, and boys and teenagers, and you got to look at what you want to do. So prior to that, I've been doing a lot with Mount Dora High School, coaching JV basketball, because I was working at the bank, and that was allowing me to be there and do those things. So a couple of times, and at that time I was in Kiwanis and talking to some people, and they said, "Hey, why don't you get an education?" And I said, no. I looked at, there's a couple of things I looked at. And most kids, when they go to college, they look at a couple of things. They look at what's the salary? What can I make? And when I was a finance and accounting major, I was looking like, okay, this is good salary. This is up here. Where's the teaching salary? Oh, it's down here. And at that point, I didn't want to be a teacher. But then, after I decided, well, okay, I can do this. It took a couple of years to try to, even out my budget to where I know I was going to be, as a teacher, and did that. And when you talk again about, family, my parents still lived in town. They were kind of retired at the time, so both boys went at that time. It was called Mount Dora Middle, which was right across the street from their grandparents. So, I'm working, and they were able to do that. Only one reason I did change was that, the bank I was working with, they decided they were downsizing in certain places, and either you could stay, they gave you some choices, and the choices always aren't the greatest. You can stay here, but this is what you have to do, or you can go here, which was in Jacksonville, and at that time it was First Union Bank, and their home office was in the Carolina, so you can go Jacksonville here or there. And I said, well, I don't feel like being uprooted and taking where I don't have that family support. I don't have that support to help me with the boys, so I just decided to get into teaching. Well, coming back it wasn't that hard for me to come back, because growing up, it was a great town to grow up in. Great town to raise little kids, or raise any family. It was like say everybody got along. It wasn't so bad that there's issues. And then living in Mount Dora, You're kind of centrally populated, you're centrally located, so it's not like, if you want to go to Orlando, you drive your few, well, now you can, back in the old days, you get on 441, you have to drive to the airport on 441, it takes you forever. Now you can get to Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, all those areas within this time frame, and you come back to Mount Dora. So it was always, that was one reason, that, I decided to come back and hang my hat here and just, and I love the kids, I wanted to let them know that you can, go other places, a lot of people do go other places but never come back. Then a lot of them do come back because, and the ones that do come back, you know what they're involved in. They're involved in mentoring, helping kids, helping families, helping, because throughout their life, those were people who were helping them. So I enjoy coming back.
So,
Yeah, it's always, that because, like I said, hey, I saw your son down here. I don't think, do you know why he's here? Yeah. And they get home and say, hey, and most of the time, it's just the courtesy to let them know that, more people, are looking at you or seeing where you are sometimes. Not to check up on you, but if they feel like you're at somewhere you're not supposed to be, they're going to make that call. And I always, welcome that call.
well, and we had one interview, and I forget who it was talking about they were downtown doing something, and then they had to get a ride somewhere, and somebody picked them up, and they'd forgotten that they rode their bicycle back. And the owner of the store said, hey, he left his bicycle here. We're closing. We're going to put it inside. He can come get it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I mean, that's just kind of the way the town was.
And that's the way the town works. Mount Dora is growing progressively more now. I did spend, when I did get back, I spent 2 years on city council in Mount Dora. Two very interesting years. You get to see special interest groups, what they want. I used to say, okay, I'll read the agenda and see what's all, prior to the meetings. And then you get there and you see the audience packed. Oh, okay, I think this is for this group here, this one's here. But my thing is that, when you get involved in stuff like that, you do what is best for the city, not special interest groups. A lot of times you get a lot of that. Even when they was trying to build a McDonald's here in Mount Dora, it was like, nope, you got one in Eustis, you don't need one here in Mount Dora. Why do we want a fast food joint here on the corner? Just a lot of little things like that you used to see and doing. And coming back, home, I got involved, like I say, Kiwanis, city, planning and zoning for the county. So I did a lot of little things like that, enjoying. But Mount Dora, kind of get you prepared for some of those things. Everybody say, well, you in a little back, hick town of Mount Dora, or you backwoods. Everybody's talking about Florida and Mount Dora and different things going on. I said, well, there's a lot of great things and a lot of great people in Mount Dora. You just got to get out and see them and become involved in things. Become involved in everything. And I always say, well, if you see everything's so bad, hey, you can volunteer. Come help me. Give me your suggestions. I like to see what you got. If we're going to complain about something, let's sit down and talk about how best to do it. Don't just tell me it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, no one's doing anything. Okay, here's your chance. Step up to the plate.
The slogan now is someplace special. And it's odd that it's always been a little different.
It's always been a little special to, me growing up, just I guess a lot of the special things that goes on is that people are working together, more so than you used to. And I think the city, not so much now. Well, they're still working together, so you got a lot of different, politics is politics, so that's never going to go away. But you got a lot of people, older people's coming back and, working, working to bridge the gap to everything, not just, East Town and downtown, or, in all the areas. They want to build everything up, because if this area is prospering, the other area is going to prosper too, and people are going to want to come. So they're going to look at the whole shebang, how the schools, how the area, what are y'all doing to make it better? Everybody's looking for something good. So I think that helps us, because everybody's working for the same thing. I can't say for the city of Eustis, the Varieds, anything like that, but I know for the city of Mount Dora, they are. And the people that are coming back to try to make a difference. They've lived the past, so they don't want the past repeating. So that's why I think there's a lot of positive stuff, and a lot of people want to move here.
I never saw Easttown as a derogatory name, but I don't know. It's like, that's part of the town.
It's part of town. That's part of town. That's how we grew up. And I was proud to be part of East Town. Where are you? I live in East Town. It's just part of, still part of Mount Dora.
That's David Willis and I were talking about, like, when I first opened the barbecue, that I was gonna like make T-shirts that just said East Town on the front, and he's like, "Man, I'll wear that everywhere."
It's just part of history. It's part of history that's never going to go away. Everybody's kind of, there's a lot of great things that happen out there. There's some things that wasn't so good, because there's, and you grow up and they say, well, East Town has gotten worse, or we're not going to deliver out to East Town. When you had Domino's and different places like that, they wouldn't deliver certain areas in East Town. I was like, why not? What's the difference? There's no difference. I had that discussion with one person at one time, at a corporate place, and I said, have you looked at my area? Because I lived in East Town. I lived on the corner of Grand and Grandview, right on the corner, and I'll give you a story. Going back, when I first bought the place or built the place, we still had a little joint across the street. It eventually got torn down. It was, that one was. If you were around, so you knew where the Buzzard Roof was. The Buzzard Roof right on the corner where I lived and built a house. So I moved it a little bit, but it was still part of East Town. So it was like, why can't you call it what it is? It's been called that all the now it's the Northeast District. That's fine. It's the same place, and like I said, whoever you talk to is going to have a different saying about it, or how do you feel about it. I never looked at it as because I grew up in East Town. So did I know anything else? Yeah, it was East Town. It was east of Mount Dora a little bit on the other side. So to me, it was a great place to live. It's still a great place to live.
I love that.
And if you look at the city itself, there's so much diversity now throughout the city. It doesn't matter where you live. There's a lot of Hispanics, a lot of blacks, a lot of Caucasians living here, and they're popping up houses all over the place. So you're going to have to be diversified. So, but East Town is East Town.
All right. Last question, and this is, what do you want people to know about growing up in Mount Dora?
Growing up in Mount Dora was an adventure. Growing up, when I grew up. So that's what I can say. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. It started out, reading, hearing all about you know, all the bad things that went on, you know, prior to, you know, me getting to an age where I can see, you know, more. You know, you hear it and you read it, but as you get older, you see some of the things that did go on. But this changed throughout every year. Things, you know, seem to progress a little more, a little more, a little more. So, growing up in Mount Dora, you see a lot of changes. Saw a lot of changes in the years growing up. From the 60s, you know, where certain places you didn't go. You know, you can still go, but were you always welcome? No. But you had some, you know, I would say, you know, even then, I had some friends that, you know, if I were not welcome, they didn't feel like they were welcome. So they would go. They would just say, okay, hey, we don't need this. We'll go here. You know, we'll go where we're really welcome. You know, and we welcome everybody. And I see that starting to, you know, that part, you know, started to, you know, get better and better and better and better. And I think that was, you know, when it continued to grow up, it became more and more prevalent throughout the area. So it made it easier for the next person coming in. You know, and I always try to instill in my kids that, you know, everybody's the same way. They put the pants on the same way, they put the shirts on the same way. It may be a little darker, a little lighter, or whatever, but as long as you treat them with respect, they're going to treat you with respect. There are certain things that you do, doesn't matter where you are. If you're in Mount Dora, you're in Tallahassee, you're in Miami, you just do the right things, even when you don't think someone's not watching you. Just, you know, throughout the years, it's been good. It's been, you know, I think Mount Dora is a great place. Great place to live. You know, family still lives here.